country, there are such institutional blinders and institutional boundaries that it's easier to say you work on cities, because everybody thinks they know what a city is, than to say you work on space. So Castell's writing in the 1960s asked, what is the scientific subject? If we're writing about the urban, and then of course there's that dispute, what's the difference between urbanism and urbanization? If urbanization represents the spread of human settlement into larger and larger areas of the world, and should urbanism then be a kind of culture? Well, then if we're looking at urbanization, we're looking at everything, at every place eventually. But how can urbanism be a way of life that's completely different from every other way of life? It is different from other ways of life. Maybe we're just looking at industrial culture, the kind of culture that grows in a society based on mass production and eventually on mass consumption. Or is it capitalism that we're looking at? This is not what most U.S. sociologists ask. The mainstream of urban sociology in the U.S. is not concerned with capitalism or with the specific economic conditions that create different spatial forms. But I'm just trying to suggest that there's confusion about what the subject of urban sociology is. And if urban sociology's subject is the city, is the city the same as an entity that has its own social order, which is different from all other places' social order? Or, when we do urban sociology, are we simply saying we look at things that happen on a particular kind of research site? The city is a research site, but what we're really doing research on is gender or social class or any age or race, ethnicity, immigration, economic location, stratification. So why should we have a separate field called urban sociology? Why don't we just say we're studying social stratification, and it happens to be that we are looking at social stratification in a place called a city. And then there's the other very interesting question. If we're looking at cities, are we simply looking at modern spaces that are created through changes in economy, culture, state organization, and technology that signify modern times? So is urbanism, modernity, and our cities simply the best research site for studying modernity, except we don't have a sociology of modernity? So I wind up with this question: is a city a place or a time? Another question that Castell raises in this essay is a question about scientific method. Again, it's very surprising in light of Castell's later work to see that he voices concern about the lack of scientific method of urban sociologists. And he reminds us that the scientific method in a laboratory involves making very systematic observations and then verifying those observations, connecting the observations to the theories that we start out with, making generalizations that then become new theories. Now, he doesn't talk about predictions, but isn't the next step of scientific method to make predictions? But nobody who studies urban sociology, I think, is making predictions. In fact, it would be pretty dangerous to make predictions about what's going to happen in cities or two spaces, I think, around the world. But if we do want to make predictions, should we have in mind that there is a set of universal processes that every city or every rural area or every exurb or suburb or town must pass through? But we don't have an evolutionary idea of what cities should become. If we did have an evolutionary idea, as I think the Chicago School did, since they were human ecologists, that idea of evolution must have been destroyed with the rise of gentrification after the 1970s. So that the centers of cities, which in many countries of the world had been economically devalued and socially devalued, and partly culturally devalued, with gentrification became much more valuable, much more interesting, and much more expensive than they had been for the previous 30 or 40 years. So if we had any idea of a single path that cities travel, in the past 40 years, that path would have to have been demolished. Or now should we say every city is going to become a city of knowledge and a creative city? I don't think so. What does that do with, what does that say about the deindustrializing cities and the shrinking cities? So, you know, there are so many processes that cities go through that we really can't, I think, can't even expect to follow a scientific method, except in the sense that we should be careful to be objective and not biased and make many observations and compare notes. Because we understand, as the geographers say, we understand spaces in relation to other spaces. We understand Torino, perhaps, in relation to Amsterdam. That's my particular moment today. Or more realistically, perhaps we understand Torino in relation to Milano, to Rome. Or coming from the U.S., I see a tremendous contrast between Torino and our automobile city, Detroit, which, as you probably know, has shrunk greatly in population. There are many abandoned buildings, abandoned houses in Detroit. There are huge problems of trying to govern